Are we calling it the gay hammer murders, or is there another term that you're using?
This is a really relatively unknown situation. So there's not some sort of like a pop culture like nickname stamped on the incidents. I called them the gay hammer murders just as a series of events for lack of a better term for now. One thing I'll elaborate on is that there were 5 or 6 victims. The sixth one is sort of a question mark. 3 of them were killed, and 2 of them were just extremely disfigured and disabled because it was an attack of a hammer on their head. There was brain damage, and they did not die immediately from their injuries. 3 people died from the attacks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Misti Gaither, and I'm the host of Quest, a journey into true crime and paranormal. And I have my co-host Willie Mackie with me. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great.
Good. I was wanting just to take a minute or two to I wanted to explain the exact reason why I started the show. Mm-hmm. And, I do have such a respect and passion for the paranormal and true crime. And I got to thinking, while we all have our differences, there are some things that we have in common. And we all have fear. We may not have the same fear, but we all have a fear of something, whether it be the fear of death, the fear of the unknown, anything that's your particular fear, it may be different. Also, we have questions, is there life after death? Why isn't this murder solved? What's going to happen to my loved ones? What's going to happen to me? Is there really spirits? And that's why that I started this show, because it is important to me, because, I have fears, I have questions. I wanted to use the gifts that I have been blessed with, of being a medium, the gift of bringing people together. And I thought, what if I brought other people in with gifts, and we could all have a piece of the puzzle and try to help others in maybe solving some of these true crimes, these cold cases, or, helping someone to get over their fears. And that's why that, I started this talk show, and I'm really appreciative that y'all have joined me on this quest, on this journey that I'm on. And, that's why we do it every week. And I just thought it would be cool just to explain to everybody the reason, not just because I was bored and wanted to do a talk show, but it actually, it has a meaning behind it.
It's the answers more than anything else.
Right.
Because there's so many questions.
There is, we always want to know, we have a fear, but we also have questions about the unexplained, the unsolved, and the unknown. And so fear and questions go together. Yeah. And so that's why we're here, to help maybe get some of those answered. Absolutely. And solved. Mm-hmm. So tonight my guest is filmmaker Vaughn Trudeau. Vaughn, thank you I know you're very busy, so thank you for being here tonight with us. Well, Vaughn he has a film that he is currently working on, and I did not know about this particular set of murders in New Orleans, because you know me, I'm all about the axe man and the axe murders. You know how I am. We talk about it. Somehow I work it in. I'm going to the grocery store and I kind of work it in. But Willie, you may not know about these murders.
When were they?
In 1984, the year of the World's Fair, I believe, in New Orleans. The name of the film is The Souls Will Wander. And Vaughn, I want you to tell me, what got you started with these, wanting to try to solve and try to help? It was 5 men killed by a hammer, and we're going to talk about what they have in common and why it is so important that these crimes be solved.
Frank Perez, our dearly beloved local queer historian, along with your friend Jeffrey.
Yes.
Who I love just as much, wrote a phenomenal book called The Queer History of the French Quarter. Lafitte in Exile was sort of the centerpiece of the book, and they used the oldest still operating gay bar in the country to tell the I don't know, just all sorts of historical, fantastic, engaging details about the queer history of the French Quarter, and I guess therefore of New Orleans in general. And when I met Frank, I immediately bought the book, but it took me a couple of years to actually open it, like I do with most books.
Right.
And when I finally read it, pretty early on in the pandemic, actually, I thought the book was just phenomenal. I really appreciated learning so much about the city that I live in and love so much, especially from its queer side. But there were just a couple sentences in the middle of the book, in the middle of a paragraph, that referenced a serial killer in the summer of 1984 who was killing gay men in the French Quarter with a hammer.
So you knew
And
about it.
yeah.
I stopped reading at that point, just paused, and was like, my first reaction to it was just sort of like no, that didn't happen.
Right.
My first reaction was, that's not true. And my reason I thought that is because I'm such a queer history nerd that with something so major as 5 men being killed with a hammer in modern history in 1984, there's no way I wouldn't have heard about that if it was actually true. That's how I first stumbled across it in the first place. I kept reading the book. I thought about it, but I kept reading the book. I finished it, and then I reached out to Frank and was like, I loved the book. Thank you for writing it, but also, did that really happen, or is that just sort of like a I don't know, myth of some sort that made it into the book? And he was like, well, I can't tell you too much because I don't know any, but I'll show you the little news clipping that I based that on in my research. And he sent me a digital scan of it. It was a little piece of an article about that big, literally that big, about 5 people attacked with a hammer by a serial killer in New Orleans. And I got real curious just about how that could be such a tiny article when something that feels so big, that especially in a city that just loves its haunted history and loves its dark, twisted tales. How is that something that I, of all people, had never heard about, and anybody else I asked hadn't heard about it either? So
Right.
that's really how it all started.
We definitely love Frank, and we do respect him. He's kind of like the keeper of our history, and Jeffrey, too, especially with that book. I mean, are we calling it kind of the gay hammer murders, or is there another term that you're using, or just?
This is a really relatively unknown situation. So there's not some sort of like a pop culture nickname stamped on the incidents. All there is just me, who randomly became obsessed with it, even though I was born 3 years after the murders happened. And there are the people who I have traced down for the past few years to try and get more and more details out of, who knew the people who were attacked with the hammer. I called them the gay hammer murders, just as a series of events, for lack of a better term for now. And yeah, one thing I'll elaborate on is that there were 5 or 6 victims. The 6th one is sort of a question mark. 3 of them were killed, and 2 of them were just extremely disfigured and disabled because it was an attack of a hammer on their head. There was brain damage, and they did not die immediately from their injuries, but I have not been able to trace either still being alive, and I was able to confirm one passed away in 1993. So 3 people died from the attacks. 2 survived the attacks, but not easily.
So are there any suspects? I mean, I know it's unsolved, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have suspects.
I have a lot of suspects.
Sure.
I think before I even tell you about the suspects, what I ought to tell you is that I was able to get a hold of all of the police records. I put in a public records request. I was denied the request, and then maybe a week later, I opened my email one day, and for some reason I just had all the records delivered to me anyway. What really shocks me is that the attacks all unfolded over the course of 35 days, which is a really, really, really short time frame, even for the world's most notorious serial killers as we know them today. That is a really short time frame. In a really small geographic area. The police, in any of their records, did not make any reference or combine any which way these cases until 10 days after the 5th or the I guess we'll call it the sixth attack potentially. At which point they made a potential connection between the 5 victims. It took a very long time for the different parts of the New Orleans Police Department, the different divisions of it, to actually communicate, I think, with each other and link that there was potentially even something possibly connected going on. So as far as suspects go, there were individual suspects for each of the victims, because there were different officers investigating the different victims. It was all very disjointed. And so those would be what I would maybe call like the formal suspects. I have not been, with the exception of a real moving target of people being arrested for the first murder and then sometimes released and then sometimes had alibis, charges dropped, that sort of thing. There does not appear to be any sort of strong central suspect of who did this or why they did this.
Well, you know, like in '84, you have to remember,
Right.
The one thing is they didn't want it to come out that it was gay bashing or gay killing or anything like that, because it was in '84 and they didn't want to get tied into that title. Like we have a serial killer in the gay community, right? And so much was lost in an investigation because they weren't doing a full investigation. The suspect or suspects had a lot of time to just remove whatever there was that could have been gathered away, because it was, I question you, and that's the end of the investigation. '84.
Right.
You
We don't
understand?
have the same networking and
You don't have people
right.
dedicated to say that there's a dead man on the street and we need to find the killer.
Right.
It's there's a dead gay man. Let's cover that up.
Right,
Move
let's
it
roll.
on. Let's roll.
Right.
Right. And when the sixth victim emerged, then it was already out that this was in the gay community, and it was the hammering, bludgeoning of gay men. Yeah, I remember that very well. Yeah.
It was back in '84. So if we roll back from '84 to '73 about the upstairs lounge,
Yeah.
right, and that is technically unsolved too.
Right.
There's speculation of whom it may be.
Right.
You know,
And they've even come out with the speculation that it was one of the customers. You know, but the fact, especially that, the fact that when it happened, they didn't remove the bodies for 2 days.
right.
I mean, literally, the bodies were in the window dead for 2 days. And because it was in the gay community back then, it was, okay, we'll get to this when we get to it.
Right.
So yeah, it's a lot.
And so, Vaughn, I mean, you've been obsessed practically with this this project about the Hammer murders, and I really liked the name you chose for your project. The Souls Will Wander. I think I know why that you called it that. Would you mind telling our audience why that you named the project?
Sure, yeah. It's actually a pull from Clayton Dellery's book about the upstairs lounge fire, which is a beautifully, beautifully written book. I would recommend that to absolutely anyone who was curious in queer New Orleans history. But his book was called The Upstairs Lounge Arson, and he is himself just a phenomenal writer. And he wrote one part of that book that there was an old Louisiana myth that one of his ex-boyfriends told him about, which is that if a cemetery isn't enclosed with a gate on all of its sides, that the souls contained in that cemetery will wander. And what that got me to thinking was, I've been just brushing up against this concept of intergenerational queer trauma, that if something as ghastly as a series of hammer murders in the middle of New Orleans, in the middle of its vibrant gay community, can happen and go deeply investigated and go unsolved, do we all sort of inherit then the darkness of what happened because there was no real justice ever brought for
Right.
it? So therefore I think of souls wandering as the the victims of any sort of violence, of queer violence, that like the one that these men all fell to. And that's where I grabbed the title from. Also, I would just love to pay as much homage to Clayton Dellery as possible.
Well, I just, the name just captivated me and the reasoning behind it. And because, spirits, they're not at rest.
Mhm.
And I mean, have you visited any of their grave sites?
I have just one is actually in New Orleans, or one that I've been able to find is in New Orleans. I visited Gene Davis's gravesite out in Metairie,
Okay.
and he's in a mausoleum. It's like his name on a wall behind the rectangle. I know one victim, I believe, was cremated, and then one was buried in his hometown in Texas, and the other one was buried, I believe, in his hometown. I want to say Missouri, but that is not on the top of my mind. And then there's a fifth victim. I have just not been able to find any information on whatsoever beyond his name and the police report of what happened the night of his attack.
Do you think that it is someone in the community or not?
I don't know. When we think about us as a community of LGBTQ people, I think we like to think of ourselves as an interconnected group of people with shared values and interests. And, a pretty central, simple value would be like not killing or violently harming each other. So as far as this person being a member of our community in that sense, I would say probably not. Do I believe that this person probably had a deep inner conflict of matters pertaining to their own sexuality? Absolutely. These victims were all found, with the exception of the potential sixth victim who might be unrelated and just coincidental. The 5 victims were all found in their own homes after what appears to have been a sex act with whoever the perpetrator was.
So that's, I don't think that was wrong of me to ask.
No, because and what's so interesting that you asked that question, in the police reports, I'm sure that was brought up, because when they were looking for witnesses or whatever, they were asking for the community help when they did come out and say it. But I remember it being brought up that this suspect could be a member of the community. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, there were definitely sightings of, at least, really well documented sightings of one of the victims leaving the Phoenix with a pretty strong description of a suspect. That's the only real written evidence I've been able to find of a suspect description. The person that Jerry Beeson, one of the victims, left a bar with. That's the closest we have. And he was the 4th victim.
That's crazy. You know what I'm saying?
Because that's a place that, that's still in operation today.
It's still in operation, but at the same time, if you got 6 victims.
Most of the places where these happened are all in operation today.
That's incredible.
Or when I say where these happened, I don't mean the murders. The murders all happened.
Where they encountered this person.
Where they picked him up. Yeah. The 5th victim was picked up at the Golden Lantern. The first victim, what is now known as the Crossing in New Orleans, was known as Gregory's Lounge in 1984, and that's where that one happened. Paul Egan, the second victim, who I have the absolute least information on, worked at the Gunga Den, which is now Stilettos, but it used to be a bar where gender-bending performers were the main attraction.
Right.
So if you think back in 1984, 1973 for the Upstairs Lounge, 1984 for these Hammer murders, and we say...
The 1977 stabbings were also of a pretty important note, I think, as well. Okay,
what is the 1977 stabbings?
And that's
there was somebody eventually who was arrested for that and charged with that. So that happened in between the two. It's a little bit, I found mixed sort of messages as to whether people believe the correct person was caught and punished for that, but somebody was.
So we have like I said, 1973, unsolved. 1984, unsolved. Now I'm hearing about 1977, maybe solved, maybe not. Okay. It seems like that there's a pattern, especially in this area, because I'm going to fast forward all the way to starting in 2016. We had the murder of Goddess Diamond, a trans youth that was beaten to death on June the 5th, 2016, and found in a burning car. And then 2017, within 2 weeks of each other, we had China Doll Dupree, also known as China Doll Gibson, and was shot to death in the East. She had came down, she's a performer, still unsolved. And then I think about a couple of weeks, a week to 2 weeks after that, also in February of that year, we have Sierra Mackie. She was stabbed and unsolved. And it just saddens me for the families, the friends, people in the, in the trans community, which is our community, that there hasn't been, resolution or answers. I mean, they're going.
You have no idea when you're talking about the 70s, especially the 80s.
Sure.
Because when I came out and started going to clubs, it was 85, 86, and one of the biggest name in the black community was Raymond Mouse. And Ford came out with an expedition in 87, and he was like one of the first persons in the city to get one, and he was killed. Still unsolved. There were many, like every week we go to the bars on Claiborne, and somebody died, unsolved. And I mean, they were found in ditches, they were found in the woods in the East, they were found just everywhere. So there's so many unsolved catastrophes in the LGBT community until it's just, especially back then, they just didn't want to tie their hands with it.
And one of the points I was trying to make is that we can say, oh, well, that was back then. That was back then. It's, they didn't have the technology. They didn't have the communication. People thought different back then than they do now. But then you fast forward it just to 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, it's still prevalent.
And it's still, there's other, like you're saying, there's others that I'm sure that we don't know about that, that maybe I personally haven't heard of that were murdered, and, there's still somebody out there questioning and wanting that.
I know in my bar alone, we're 10 years old.
Right.
And in 10 years, we've lost 6 people to murder that are unsolved.
So you have to wonder, like, why is it? Is it because of color? Is it because of being gay?
Yeah.
Being trans? I mean, also in the description about your film, it's, talks about how many trans people in America, some of them that's been murdered, and some of them have answers, and probably most of them don't. And it's, it's like an epidemic, and the lack, and we can, as a community, we can say the cops, the law enforcement should do more, and we can say, well, this one should have did this one, but it really ultimately it's with us, because in our community, I'm sure somebody knows something about some of this. I mean, it's just sad because whether it's fear, they just don't want to get involved.
Period.
Right. Like, oh, well, that's not my problem. That's not my family. I don't care. And so it just really saddens me that we as a community, that we don't get outraged, or we don't demand answers of not only law enforcement, but we don't demand answers from ourselves about why that we haven't, tried to do something collectively to try to get these solved, or try to change things so that this doesn't happen.
And it's still happening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a piece of evidence that is about the Hammer murders?
When I started really looking into this heavily, part of looking into it heavily was just tracking down anybody who knew any of the people who were affected by this string of attacks in some way. And the further and further I got in it, and the further I just realized how just very deeply disenfranchised they all felt toward the local law enforcement at the time. What I actually started to do was I just started to try to find my own connections within our modern day version of that same law enforcement division, because the 2020s, we'll call them, because I've been working on this for a few years, is a very different time than the 1980s.
Right.
as far as LGBTQ visibility and advocacy, and there are several openly queer people serving on the NOPD now, and through their help, I was able to, in so many ways, get the case reopened, though the case had never really been considered to be closed in the first place. That was single-handedly through the help of LGBTQ law enforcement people.
Great team. We're really blessed by having that team representing us too.
It would be awesome if more people realized that going into law enforcement was an option for LGBTQ people when they're looking for careers. I know a lot of people just have bad experiences and bad, have conceptions about going into that aren't for good reason. So going to a few of them, they were able to get the cold case division to go searching for the evidence from 1984. They found the evidence, which is also that was pretty unlikely to us that would happen. Given that Hurricane Katrina did a real number on a lot of the warehouses that housed evidence. So what they found had been not affected by any of those floods, and they found a box containing one of the original hammers that was found on the murder scene for the 5th victim, and they were able to send that in for new DNA testing. Now, here's the part I don't understand. Apparently it takes 18 months to get something tested, and it doesn't matter how important they think that thing is. I don't know. I guess when it's cold case, you're just immediately on the bottom of the pile of importance, and there was nothing I could do, including trying to pay any extra fees they wanted for it to happen. But yeah, there is new DNA capabilities that were far from existing in 1984. So there's a chance that something is going to turn up on the hammers.
So how long do we have to the 18 months?
I'm really bad at time, especially. I don't know. Time is all the same to me now, but I would say that was probably 7 months ago. So I'm guessing we have probably a year until the 18 months are crossed.
All right.
I don't know if anyone wants to raise a stink with me and try to. The cold case people were like, "Hey, any stink you raise to get people mad about this is good for us because we don't like being on the bottom of the pile either." So
would it be like at the where is it at? Like at the troopers, or like an independent lab, or
where is the evidence?
Yeah, like the hammer. Where did they send it off to?
It gets sent to a facility in Baton Rouge because New Orleans doesn't currently have one. And at that facility is where they process or reprocess, in this case, the evidence, and then do the testing.
So when do you think the film will be out?
I have no idea.
Okay.
In my lifetime.
Yeah.
That's my safe answer.
That's close.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm ever going to find out who did it. To me, that's never actually been what my curiosity has been about. What I've always been most curious about is how did this happen, and how did it completely vanish from our collective minds?
That can be part two.
Willie,
that can be part two.
Even just hearing it, when people hear it, it rings something in their ears.
It jars in your mind. Yeah, absolutely.
It jars in your mind, but how wild is that something so major just disappeared, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm the most curious about.
And the little cube of
that's all
newspaper.
You have. That's all you have.
That's all. That's it. You know,
a sales ad.
If I don't know if any of your listeners remember this, or knew somebody who knew somebody involved in it in some way. I am still 2.5 years into this. I am still just constantly trying to track down information, and I would love to hear what people think.
Well, you know what? I appreciate you being a guest on the show. It means a lot to me. I know it does to Willie too. And we will definitely stay in touch about the situation and try to do what we can do to help. And for those of you who are watching, stay aware and remember those that don't have their voice anymore, because that's important for us to be someone's voice. And so thank you, Vaughn, and I will be seeing you soon.
You definitely will. And if there's something I can add to that message you just sent, it would be, I am in my 30s, and I was definitely somebody who for a long time would go out into nightlife scenes to go see my friends or meet up with people. And until I really started working on this story, what I didn't realize is there are people who are different generations than me now, younger and older, but I'm really referring to the older generation. And there are people who are in these same LGBTQ spaces that I'm in. And for so many years, I just didn't ever think to like open conversations with them or really talk to them. And once I started working on this, I just realized that, you know, people from different generations from us have just the most fascinating perspectives on the world and on queer life that I would never ever have known or come across if I hadn't learned how to lean into that curiosity. And I have made so many friends because of that. Like Misti, I would say indirectly, you're a reason one of the reasons I know you is just through my work on this, right?
Right,
We
right.
don't frequent the same bars or anything, but through friends that I've made doing this project, like now I know you and I don't know, there's such rich friendships that you can build with people whose backgrounds, whose communities are in that huge wide LGBTQ umbrella, but maybe aren't in the exact same like corner of the demographic you think
Right.
yourself are
Yeah.
in.
Thank you so much for being on the show. Appreciate you and see you soon. Have a good night.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
All right,
Vaughn.
thank
Good to
you.
meet you.
You know, that was really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, somebody knows something.
Listen, I remember going out in 84 when all this was going on, and my buddies was like, okay, we need to stay together because, you know, there are people killing people. And we were young. We were kids. We didn't care about
You're
any of
right.
that.
Yeah, it ain't going to happen to me.
Why would it happen to
Right.
me?
Mm-hmm.
And it did.
Yeah.
It happened to people we know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's sad. And you know, we have organizations
Yeah.
that, you know, when things happen, you know, they send out a little press release. We're mourning with whomever and their family and friends.
And that's it.
That's it, you know. And 8 years later,
Yeah.
their family and friends still mourning. I'm sure that the family and friends appreciate the mention, but you know what? Time marches on.
Yep.
And those family and friends in our community kind of at a standstill.
Yeah, because they can't forget.
Right.
They need closure.
Right.
You know, it's a moral responsibility on everybody to make sure that this stuff is solved. And I know, there's no way you and I can go out and you leave with this guy and you come up missing, and I can't tell anybody the person you left with.
Right.
And you and I went out together.
Yeah. If that was the man back in 84 that was with the person, you know, that they were coming out of the Phoenix, somebody saw him, and they did give a description. I'm thinking it's got to be somebody around here.
Well, and there is. It's just that it's the way life is. You know, I don't want to bloody my hands with this because this is not my problem.
It's not my problem.
I
I don't
know.
have time.
I know, but I just don't want to get involved with this.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's a shame, and we can't change some people that are like that. And it's sad. And sometimes it's also very sad that some situations don't have answers. But I have to believe.
Let's fast forward 40 years. The way it's set up now, you cannot go in anywhere and not be seen.
Right.
You cannot walk through a door and you're not visually, there's a picture of you or a video of you going anywhere. Now it's like if something like that happens, well, this person left with this person. And you can instantly, on the second incident, this is the same guy. The third incident, now you have a situation.
Right. There he is again.
There he is again.
Right.
Yeah.
That reminds me of another case that's unsolved still. January the 1st, 2016, Josh Woodruff on the corner of Decatur and Dumaine, trying to walk across the street. A car comes. He's pinned under the car and drug from Decatur all the way over the GNO, which is about 8 miles or so, still unsolved.
Yeah.
And so every New Year's, his family and friends, you know, we're all celebrating Happy New Year. And they have that, you know, like, well, you know, our son, he went to New Orleans. And then just recently, the people from the Howdy Bagels from up north, and one of them got shot in the Maroney. And I think they may have arrested someone. I'm not 100% sure about that. But the Josh Woodruff case, they have the picture of the car.
Mm-hmm.
They have allegedly 2 witnesses. They have a composite sketch. They have the tattoo on his neck is still unsolved. Mm. And I would be in horror to know that my friend or my family was drugged under a car for that long. Yeah, I just can't, that is one case that really, there's a lot of them that sticks with me, but that one I think about a lot, So it's just, so anyway, thank you so much everyone for watching another episode of Quest. So if you can, hit that subscribe button for me and like the episode, tell your friends about the show, and you'll be seeing a lot more of us in the very near future. Thank you so much to Willie Mackie, my co-host and friend. Uh-huh. Thank you to Brandon, my producer and director. So thank you, everyone, and I will see you next week. Good night.